Hello and welcome to Drunk on Tea. I've recently picked up this set of Vallejo Model Color paints, and today I'm going to test them out and see if you should add these paints to your collection. The set was £30 from Amazon for 16 paints. It's a World War II colour set, so ideal for bolt action players, but I'm going to see how they work for Warhammer 40K and some Death Korps of Krieg. How would real world colours fit in the grim dark future of the 41st millennium? This is the model I'm going to paint, a Kriegsman Sergeant that I've primed black to give an even base coat for the minis. First, with olive green, I'm going to paint the coat. This colour is a common uniform colour, so should give a nice colour for the coat and the main colour for this mini. The paint applies nice and smoothly. It's quite thin from the bottle, so I've only used a tiny bit of water to thin it so I can have an even consistency. The Vallejo dropper bottles don't come with any balls in, and the paints do separate quite quickly, so be prepared to get a workout shaking all of the paints so they mix properly before trying to get some paint out of the bottle. The coverage of the minis is good. It does apply evenly, which is always nice and makes painting a lot more enjoyable. It will take a couple of layers to get solid coverage, but only 2 or 3 should be needed, so the pigmentation of these paints must be quite high. I'm applying this olive green all over the outside to the coat, making sure not to paint the inside parts or the cuffs at this stage. After a couple of layers, you can see I've built up a solid layer of green, and it really has the World War II colour to it. Now with khaki, I'm going to paint the inside of the coat. This paint is also quite thin, but applies smoothly with good coverage. The paints are easy to control and don't seem to want to run away from me, so I feel confident painting details and close to other colours. At no point when painting this model did I feel that any of the colours were going to be messy or cause an issue. The feel of the paints is very consistent amongst all of the paints that I tried out. The finish of these paints is quite matte, unlike Citadel or Army Painter paints that tend to be more satin, which is between matte and gloss, or flat and shiny to use the non-technical terms. I don't mind the matte finish, and if you're someone who uses matte varnish, this really wouldn't be a problem. But for some people who are used to the satin finish, it could be a bit off-putting, especially if used on the same model as Citadel paints, as you would need to varnish the model afterwards to have a consistent finish. Although the matte finish does give a more realistic appearance at the end, it's just a different style than some people would be used to, and more suited to real-world miniatures rather than the fantasy style of 40K and Age of Sigmar. I'm also painting the cuffs to the model and this fabric on the backpack with some khaki. I don't know if this is a blanket, but I'm painting it with khaki. With the khaki painted, you can see how that real-world style is coming together on the model. Now with olive brown, I'm painting the trousers. As this is darker, I'm being careful around the khaki of the inner cloak, but this olive brown gives a nice look to the trousers. It's quite an earthy colour, but ties in well with the others to complete the look of the uniform. With the trousers being painted, that's a large area of the uniform completed. Next, with field drab, I'm going to paint the gas mask and straps. I'm catching the gas mask with a couple of layers of field drab. This is a bit brighter than the olive brown, but also applies well and gives good coverage. I'm also catching all of the straps on the model, so areas like these ones here around the legs. This colour works well for areas like this, giving a nice neutral tone to these details. I'm also catching the belt and any other straps on the model, like these ones on the backpack. This paint applies nice and smoothly, and all the colours in the set seem to work together to give a nice unified paint scheme to the model. With the straps and mask painted, the mini is getting that Krieg look. Now with English uniform, I'm going to paint the pouches. This is a nice light brown colour and should work really well for the pouches on the backpack. I've been really impressed by the coverage of these paints so far. They all apply smoothly, and in just 2 coats I've managed to get a solid coverage all over everything I've painted. There isn't a lot of colour variation in this set. As it's a themed set, it's mostly just greens and browns, but those were the colours of uniforms in the Second World War. I'm not a historical expert, so I can't say how accurate these colours are to the uniforms that they're trying to emulate, but they work well for what I'm doing here, which is creating a colour scheme that feels like it could be a real uniform, even if it isn't. With the pouches painted, I'm going to paint the boots and gloves next. For this, I'm using the black in the set. This paint is a solid black colour. If you're going to try and add shades, they probably won't show up against this black, but it does give solid coverage in just a single layer, so if you're looking for a solid black, this Vallejo one is worth keeping an eye on. With the black painted, I'm going to paint the casings to the weapons next. I'm using gunship green for this. This colour is probably supposed to be used on vehicles. It has the look of a colour of the outside of a tank or other vehicle, as I'm painting casings to weapons that I assume would be painted metal. This paint works quite well. This is a bit lighter than I normally paint my gun casings for my minis, but the paint gives a solid colour, and it's different enough from the green that I use for the coat to make the weapon stand out and look like a different material than the rest of the model. As well as the bolt pistol, I'm also catching the casings to the chainsword, making sure I get a solid coat of gunship green all over the casings. With the weapons painted, the model's really starting to come together. Now with white, I'm painting some details on the chainsword. I'm painting the stripes on the chainsword and the aquila on the other side. This is quite a nice white. It gives good coverage, even over the black, and it isn't chalky in texture like some other whites. I know a lot of people complain over Games Workshop white paints, and although I think White Scar is quite a good paint, if you do want to avoid GW, this white from Vallejo may be the white to pick up. With the white painted, next I'm going to paint the metal. For this, I'm using gunmetal grey. I'm painting this all over the armour panels, helmet and metal parts to the weapons. I hate this paint. It's far too shiny. It doesn't show on camera as much, but this paint is like painting with glitter. Maybe the metallic flakes are too big, but it's far too bright, especially next to the matte finish from the rest of the paint. The coverage is also pretty bad. It's very thin, so it wants to run off the areas as I'm painting, leaving behind a sparkle from the glitter-like parts, but without adding any colour to the areas. It took a few layers to get a solid coat over all of these areas. Because of the metallic flakes in it, the areas also seem to shine in a multicoloured kind of reflection, which doesn't help with the coverage issues. I don't think that metal should be this shiny. I much prefer a more muted look. I was planning to avoid using shades on this model, but after seeing the gunmetal paint, I know I'm going to need to knock back the shine a bit with some known oil in a later step. With the metal looking super shiny, there is one more base colour left to apply. And that's with some Retributor armour, because there isn't any golds or other metallics in this set. I'm using Retributor armour to pick out the aquila and any other details on the model. These areas are quite small, and I could have painted them with the gunmetal grey, but the Retributor armour will add that pop of colour and interest to the model, while also keeping that 40k look. With the gold painted, I'm going to shade that silver next, and I'm doing this to take that shine effect off of the metal with some known oil. I'm applying this all over the areas I painted with it, making sure it doesn't pull heavily, making sure it darkens down that glitter a bit, and give a more grim dark appearance to the model. If you're enjoying the video, please press like. If you want more videos, press the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. And if you'd like to support the channel, please become a member by pressing the join button down below or joining me over on Patreon. After the shade has dried, it's darkened down that metal, and now I can start some highlights. Starting with a mix of olive green and pale sand, I'm mixing just a bit of pale sand into my olive green so I get a slightly lighter colour. Most of my highlights will be the same, adding a bit of pale sand to the base colour. I'm using pale sand instead of white so I don't desaturate the colours, just brightening them up a little bit. I'm applying this as a thin highlight at their very edges to all of the folds and tops of all the creases, brightening them up just a little bit, adding some extra detail, but I'm not going to go overboard. I want this to be a simple colour scheme at the end, and I want to stay in that more realistic look rather than the edge highlights everywhere look of 40K. I'm keeping these highlights nice and thin and just picking out the sharpest edges and most raised details with a small highlight of olive green and pale sand. With that highlighted, it's added some more definition to the coat. Now with khaki and pale sand, I'm highlighting the inside of the cloak. These paints seem to mix well. The pale sand does a great job of keeping the tone of the original paint, but just brightening it up a bit, so it makes a nice, quick and easy highlight colour. Once again, I'm applying small lines on all the sharpest points to add that extra detail and highlight these areas. I'm also catching the details on the fabric on the backpack, keeping the highlights small, but catching all the folds. And finally, I'm also highlighting the gas mask. I'm applying this all over the flatter and raised areas of the mask, leaving that darker colour in the recesses of the mask, so I can create a focal point to the model quickly and easily. With the straps and gas mask highlighted, it's added some real character to the model. Now with olive brown and pale sand, I'm highlighting the trousers. Much like with the details before, I'm just catching the sharpest details and applying a quick, simple highlight to the model, adding some extra definition and helping to bring out the shape of the model even more. After highlighting the trousers, next I'm going to highlight the straps. I'm using US Field Drab and Pale Sand again for this. I'm catching any of the raised details on any of the straps. For the leg straps, I'm just catching the edges to the straps with a thin highlight, being careful to keep these lines nice and thin. I'm also catching all of the other straps with a highlight of this mix. Mixing these paints seems to work. Some paint lines don't act well to being mixed and the colours can end up being a bit off. But these paints mix easily and the end result is a slightly brighter version of the original colour, which is ideal for these kinds of highlights. Well, I'm going for a more subtle highlight rather than the bright heavy metal style that I often use on my minis. After the straps are highlighted, I'm going to do the same for the pouches, mixing some pale sand with English uniform. And I'm catching the very edges with a thin highlight of this mix again. I'm just catching the very edges to the pouches with a very thin highlight, give the impression of a bit of wear and tear to these areas, or that the light is gently reflecting off of any edges to the pouches. With the pouches highlighted, there's only a few more steps left to go. Using gunship green and pale sand, I'm highlighting the edges to the cases to the weapons. I'm keeping this nice and small again, and tracing my way around the outside of all of the panels of the casing to the bolt gun, catching them all with a thin highlight of this mix. And I'm doing the same again for the chainsword. On the open areas, I can use the side of my brush to get smooth, straight, even lines. Because of the high pigmentation to these paints, they work really well for highlights, giving a nice, solid highlight in a single brush stroke on the details. With the weapon cases highlighted, next up it's the black details. I'm using black and pale sand to get a dark grey colour. I'm just catching the ridges to the tube on the gas mask, making sure I keep this small and just catching those raised details. I'm also highlighting any of the raised details on the boots, as the black I painted these with is so black. Just a few small details will add some definition to these areas. And finally, I'm also highlighting the gloves, catching each of the knuckles to the fingers and the fingertips as well with some of this grey. And with the black highlighted, there is just one more thing to paint on this Krieg Sergeant. With some Evil Sun Scarlet, as there isn't any reds in this set, I'm carefully painting the eyes to the gas mask. The red will add a pop of colour and give the sci-fi look, so the rest of the colours have all been very historical. I'm being very careful not to paint the rest of the gas mask, only sinking Evil Sun Scarlet into the lenses. And with the eyes painted, that is the Kriegsman complete. I could have added more highlights or done some shading, but I wanted to focus on the colours of this set and paint it in a way more like I would paint Bolt Action, rather than how I traditionally paint 40K. The paints are good, except for the silver. That is one of the worst silvers I've ever used. If you're looking to try some different paints or want to paint your models in a more historical style, I would recommend trying out these Vallejo paints, The matte finish is a bit different, but worked well for these colour schemes, and I was impressed with how good the coverage of the paints was. Let me know in those comments down below, have you ever used these Vallejo paints before, and what do you think of this model? Would you paint a Krieg army in a World War II inspired style? Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and happy painting.